Time for us to check back in with the thread that runs so true and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. The Kentucky school law required the superintendent of county schools to visit each rural school under his supervision at least once during the school term. At a board meeting, I read this law. Then I reminded members of my school board that I didn't have an expense account. After I paid for room, board, laundry, I wouldn't have enough left for my $100 a month to pay my expenses to visit these schools. They had voted my predecessor, Larry Anderson, a $160 expense account, and this was certainly not enough considering the amount of traveling necessary. Greenwood County had a vast and sprawling network of rural schools that covered hundreds of square miles of mountainous terrain where the few roads became impassable after the autumn rains had fallen in November. My school board allowed me $50 to visit 82 rural schools that were from 3 to 8 miles apart. If they had not appropriated the money, I would have walked from school to school. This would have required more time away from my office, where the work was always stacked ahead of me. I knew I couldn't wait too long to visit the rural schools. I had to go while the roads were good. I had to beat the November rains. It was October now. I contacted Lester Larks, who owned an old topless Chevrolet Roadster. Lester was a big blonde-headed, left-handed baseball pitcher who had pitched first for the Lansboro Owls, later for Harlan County Coal Miners League. He lived at Plum Grove and was a near neighbor of mine. We had gone to the one-room Plum Grove Rural School together, where Lester had reached the 5th grade. Lester, I've had $50 appropriated for me by my school board to visit 82 rural schools, I explained. How much would you take to drive me over the county? Since I have the right kind of car for the roads and have nothing to do now that baseball season is over, I'll take $3 a day and expenses, he laughed. I know, Stuart, that in 82 rural schools in Greenwood County, we're bound to find some beautiful young women teaching school, he said. The only thing that I ask of you is, if I find one I can fall in love with, don't you try to cut me out. It's a bargain, I said. You be at my office at 7 in the morning. At 7 that morning, Lester and I climbed into the topless Roadster. We didn't wear overcoats and we didn't wear hats. We left Lansboro in a hurry for the school, Mountain View, which was the farthest from Lansboro of any rural school in Greenwood County. I'd heard teachers refer to this school as Greenwood County's most distant outpost. We wanted to visit first the rural schools farthest away from the county seat. We wanted to visit them while the weather was right for us. Lester drove as fast as the road would allow up Route 1 until we reached Lost Hollow. Then we started up a road that was in the creek and out of the creek for the next 5 miles. Once our engine drowned out in a hole of water, we had to pull off our shoes and roll up our pant legs and wade the ice-cold water to shove the car forward. We did it easily. The two of us weighed 400 pounds, and we were strong as oxen. But from now on, Lester was more careful about driving through the water holes. It was a beautiful morning to drive. The high hills were blanketed white with frost. The brisk wind brought color to our faces. High on the hilltops above this narrow-gauged valley, the frost was rising in white clouds, beautiful but formless in the morning rays of autumn sun. We were in Greenwood County's finest burley tobacco district. Every farmer in Lost Hollow raised light burley tobacco. We passed the giant tobacco barns, whose tier poles were empty now, of this bright-colored aromatic plant. We passed little creek bottoms and steep hill slopes where last year's drought-dwarfed tobacco plant stood unharvested. The harvest had been too worthless to reap. Through the shallow holes of blue water, our car wheels rolled on the slick slate rock bottom. Then we came to the end of our creek bed road. A water gap fence spanned the creek. Here we stopped. Lester finally turned the car in this narrow-gauged valley until it was facing the direction we had come. Then at a nearby farmhouse, we asked directions to Mountain View School. "Go through the drawbars yander," said a housewife at a little log shack. "Then go up the pint until you come to the old road. My husband says it's 6 pipes of tobacco or 2 miles from here to the schoolhouse, and that you follow your nose instead of your right or left hand. Straight ahead," she laughed, "straight ahead." "I'll bet this is some school," Lester said, as we hand-sprung across the drawbars. "Not even a wagon road leading to it. Wonder how they get coal up there to burn." "I don't know," I said, as I followed Lester up the well-worn path that was getting steeper all the time. "This is some climb up to the school." I knew that this was the one rural school district in Greenwood County where a rural merchant, approximately 8 miles away, drove in each year in late September with a truckload of shoes. And since he couldn't get to the people, they came to him, for he announced the day of his coming. At the same place where we had parked our car, the parents in this district brought their children to the shoe truck, where their summer brown feet were fitted into brogan shoes. In normal times, each child received 1 pair of shoes for the year. This was the only district in Greenwood County I knew that still did this. Buying shoes for the winter was a great day for everybody. They could all get together and have their feet fitted into shoes and make a holiday of the affair. When Lester and I climbed halfway up the hill, though it was getting near noon, the October sun was just lifting the frost from the deep valley. We stopped to catch our second wind and looked down over Lost Hollow. Clouds rising from this narrow valley streamed skyward, thin, white sheets of vapor, like fresh laundered sheets buoyed by the blue crisp wind. While up around us on the hill, the leaves on the autumn trees were clouds of a different color. The leaves were dried by the sun, and they rustled in the morning wind. There were red clouds of leaves, brown leaves, golden and light golden. There were leaf clouds of many colors, depending on the direction one looked. And there was still a patch of world above, just a little island of high hilltop, and not another house on it, but a schoolhouse. "This is something to see," Lester said, "but if I had to climb this mountain every morning to school, I wouldn't have my 5th grade education." Before we had reached the top of this little island in the highlands, we had whetted up an appetite. "Boy, am I hungry," Lester said. "There's not any place here to buy sardines and crackers," I said. Less than 100 yards from the hilltop, we followed the ridge path around a curve. Here was the schoolhouse. Just as we reached the schoolyard, school dismissed for noon. We crossed the yard filled with barefooted, ruddy-cheeked, husky pupils. Many of them were larger than high school pupils. They eyed us suspiciously as we greeted them and walked over to the schoolhouse. We found Mrs. Ethel Henthorne inside. "I'm Jesse Stuart, Mrs. Henthorne," I said. "Oh, our new superintendent," she smiled. "I've heard a lot about you." She was a large, elderly lady with a shock of gray hair piled on her head. "This is Lester Larks, who is driving me around to visit the schools," I said. "You young men haven't had any dinner, have you?" We didn't have time to answer her. "We'll share with you," she said. "You know you're far away from a house or a country store up here. Wait a minute, I don't have enough for all 3 of us." She moved slowly across the schoolhouse, for walking seemed to be difficult for her. "Our county school superintendent, Jesse Stuart, and his friend, Lester Larks, are here without their dinner," I heard her telling the pupils. "We must share with them." While Ethel Henthorne was outside, I looked over the inside of this one-room school. The blackboards had been washed before school was dismissed for noon. Above the blackboards and between the windows were decorations of autumn leaves, clusters of red shoemake berries, bittersweet, pale blue, and white farewell to summer. They were artistically arranged in contrasting colors, flowers and leaves, shoemake berries, bittersweet, and mountain laurel. I had never seen a room in any high school as well decorated. It was the prettiest schoolroom I had ever seen. "Ain't this room sumptuous?" Lester said. "Never expected to find anything like this up here. Who is this Mrs. Henthorne, anyway?" I didn't have time to answer him, for she came through the door with many pupils following her. Each pupil offered to share his lunch with us. Dry cornbread never tasted better to me. Very few of these pupils had anything besides dry cornbread. There were no cakes or candy, no food delicacies, only the rough, solid food for the body's subsistence. Yet here was the strongest-looking, most handsome group of pupils I had ever seen in a rural school. Lester ate dry cornbread too. Later he said he wished he'd had a half a gallon of cold buttermilk with his cornbread. After we had shared lunch with the Mountain View pupils and Mrs. Henthorne, Lester went out on the school ground to play baseball with the boys. An 8th grade pupil who had heard of Lester Larks got his catcher's mitt and asked Lester to pitch for him. And while Lester pitched and he caught, and the boys tried to hit the left-handed drops, I talked to Mrs. Henthorne. "How long have you been teaching here?" 4 years, Mr. Stuart," she said. "Isn't it a very inconvenient place for you to teach?" "Yes, very inconvenient," she admitted. "But for every inconvenience, there is a compensation. And I've taught many rural schools in this county. I've met many fine people here. But," she spoke with enthusiasm, "these are the finest people I have ever known. I don't have a discipline problem. My pupils know I'm trying to help them. They love me for it." "How do you get coal up here?" I asked. "We don't burn coal," she said. "We burn wood. My boys here in school and their fathers cut it. There's plenty of wood here." "Mrs. Henthorne, do you live in Mountain View School District?" I asked. "Oh, me, I don't," she said. "I board in this school district. I room and board at Prater's down at the foot of the mountain. My home is over at Oldham." "I don't see how you're able to climb up here every morning and go back down in the afternoon," I said. It would have been much better if the trustees of one of the rural districts had given me a school somewhere on a highway. But when one gets old, she sighed, when one gets old, one cannot choose. One has to take what is given him. I was glad to be hired to teach Mountain View. One year, you know, none of the trustees in this county would hire me. Superintendent Larry Anderson and the members of the Greenwood County School Board wanted me, but the trustees didn't. I didn't get a school. When they hired me for Mountain View, I didn't grumble. I knew I had a mountain to climb, but I figured out a way to do that, she continued. Willis Prater has 2 large boys in school, and each morning one of them takes me by the hand and helps me up the mountain. Sometimes, she explained, John Phillips, one of my large 8th grade boys who lives near Prater's, gets behind me and shoves. Myrtle Phillips often carries my books. My pupils are good to me. "But when the snow falls," I questioned. "Get up the same way I do when the weather is good," she answered quickly. "The boys help me." "Getting down the mountain is another problem, Mr. Stuart," she whispered, bending over closer to me. "When we have sleet and the ground is slick, my pupils have to let me down the mountain with ropes. I keep the ropes here in the schoolhouse for winter emergencies." I didn't ask Mrs. Ethel Henthorne how heavy she was. I guessed her to weigh between 240 and 260 pounds. Her shock of high-piled hair was the color of frosted crabgrass. Her eyes sparkled like water in the sunlight when she talked to me. "I have to teach school, Mr. Stuart," she said. "I've taught all my life, and I've never been able to put anything away for a rainy day. See, summer after summer, I've gone to Moorhead College, and I've worked off a few college hours, until I now have my degree. Oh, she laughed, I didn't get it until I was nearly 70, but I got it. I'm a college graduate now. I wanted all my life to be one. My ambition was finally realized. I started teaching after I finished the 5th grade. Later, I finished high school and finally college. It has taken me more than 50 years to do it, she laughed, but it's better late than never. Now, when you leave the mountain, you stop at the hickory grove on your right and look down, and you can see the shack at the foot. That's where the Praters live. The path that bends back and forth up the hill is the one I climb every morning and go down every afternoon. Mrs. Henthorn talked on. She told me that this would be a hard year on her pupils since the drought had destroyed the money crops, tobacco and cane, and the food crops. She apologized that her pupils were barefooted this late in autumn. She said the truck hadn't brought them shoes yet. She told me that she had often seen red spots on the frost where her pupils had come to school ahead of her, and she said she guessed many would have to stop coming to school as soon as the snows fell on this mountain. Before the noon hour was over, I went outside to watch the boys and girls play ball. They had chosen sides, and Lester was umpiring the game for them. They were having the time of their lives. Pupils too small to play had divided into groups, and each group was rooting for one of the teams. I watched the ball game for a few minutes, and then I went around the schoolhouse and looked it over. This schoolhouse had once been painted, but now it was weathered gray with many strips of weatherboarding gone until one could look inside and see the studding. This building was not as good, not half as good, as some of the barns owned by little one-horse farmers in rural Greenwood County. I wondered how it held together during the great windstorms that swept this mountaintop. I wondered if the time wouldn't come when it would blow apart and instantly kill these pupils and their teacher. While I was looking the schoolhouse over and down below me in every direction at the multicolored clouds of autumn leaves, the bell rang for books and the ball game ended. The pupils lined up outside and marched in. There were smiles on their sweaty red faces. They were happy in Mountain View School. They hadn't any thought of a storm that might blow their ramshackle schoolhouse to pieces and kill all of them. This was the place they loved to come. It was not a task for them to climb the mountain to school. It was a recreation. Cornbread was all right for them to eat too, and it was all right to come barefooted in the frost. While Lester and I joined the line of boys and marched inside with them, boys that had shared their lunches with us, I wished many of the Lansboro High School pupils could have been there. I wish they could have compared their educational opportunities with those of the Mountain View people. Soon as the pupils were seated, Mrs. Henthorn asked me to say something to them. I faced this group of sturdy, stalwart, and eager youth and spoke to them for about 25 minutes. I told them they could further their education without any more of a struggle than they were having now, if they were ambitious and willing to try. That education was not a commodity to be bought and sold, but something that gave one more realization and enjoyment of the many things that life held in store. That with more education, the mysteries and the beauties of life would unfold before them like the buds of leaf and flower in the spring. I told them they would even see more beauty in their natural surroundings than they saw now. Then I sat down. For the next 30 minutes or longer, Mrs. Henthorn's pupils entertained us. One of the sweaty-faced ball players stood up and recited Keats to Autumn. Another recited Whittier's The Barefoot Boy. A girl recited Annabel Lee. One recited Longfellow's A Psalm of Life. At least a dozen good poems were recited by these pupils. Then they sang Beautiful Dreamer by Stephen Foster and followed it with a number of familiar folk songs. When they had finished, Mrs. Henthorn gave a reading, James Whitcomb Riley's Little Orphan Annie. Lester Lark sat spellbound at this entertainment by his ball players. I never enjoyed school entertainment more than this spontaneous program by Mountain View rural pupils and their teacher. Lester and I said goodbye to her and her pupils. We had to hurry. We had to stop at 5 more schools. We had to visit Upper Lost Hollow, Lower Lost Hollow, Hopewell, Cane Creek, and Oldham rural schools before this day was over. I had to make the time count while I was spending the $50 appropriated by my Greenwood County Board of Education for this purpose. Really interesting part of the book here. I really enjoyed this section. I hope you did. I can just picture it with Jesse's wonderful writing there. Just picture the whole part of it. The very first part is really striking when you think about how we live today. So he needed to go visit all those schools. It was a real big county spread out with lots of little schools here and there, over 80. But yet he needed to do it before the November rains come, because in those days it's just such a drastic difference than the way we live today. He had to worry about all those roads, because once the rain started, there was not. If there was pavement, there wasn't very much pavement. There certainly wouldn't have been. Obvious in this part where we're reading about Mountain View, there wasn't even roads to get to some of them. So he really had to think about that, and really had to think that he knew he needed to hurry before those rains of November come and just really made the travel treacherous and really just impossible. So such a different time. Now today you might think, like we hear ahead of time it's going to come a snowstorm or something, you might think, well, I'm not going to go up on the mountain because it's, I'm not going to head to Highlands if you're here in my area or something like that, or I'm not going to try to drive on one of the little roads that leads up on the mountain where you can look off, or I'm not going to go to Tellico. All these kind of places come to mind for me in my local area, and they probably do for you too, if you knew it was going to come a snowstorm or something, But as far as rain and stuff like that, that really wouldn't stop any of us, unless it was a flood that we seen with our own eyes and we were not going to drive across, those kind of things. But just such a different time that was his first thought, that I have to do this before the November rains come, or I won't be able to do it at all. He knew that. He knew it was going to take him a while. And you got to remember, in those days, we've learned this earlier in the book, their school year was much shorter. Like, my first thought when I read that was, well, you have all the way till next May, but not really, because their school system was different in those days, and they did not go to school as long a time period as children do today. And the school board wasn't going to give him no money, were they? Which, to take up for him, I guess, on this part, is that there was no money. You remember, if the budget was so tight, there really was no money. So it's a miracle, I guess, that they give him anything, but they didn't sound like they were willing to give him very much, but I'm sure the budget played a role in that. Well, Mooner might just not have wanted to give him any, but the rest of them is probably for mostly because of that. Now, when it sounds beautiful to me, that trip to Mountain View, he describes it like it's a kind of a chilly morning, especially you can see the frost up on the mountains, and then having to drive and having to ford the creeks on that road. In my lifetime, I've been through, especially when I was really young, a few people's driveways that you still had to ford the creek like that, but not many, and not in long time. I mean, Granny tells the story of the first time she ever come to Wilson Holler, when her and Pap were, I don't remember if they dated, or they only dated like 3 months and then they got married. It may have been even after they were married, but the first time she ever come to Wilson Holler, down the road below kind of where the houses of my family, extended family, start, that was the first house was my grandfather and grandmother's, Papa and Mama, we called them, Pap's parents, and that house is no longer there now. But that would have been the only house there at that time, would have just been that one. Anyway, but the last there's a culvert now it's been my whole life, so there's been a culvert, but in those days that culvert wasn't there, and Granny said you had to drive through the creek, so Pap had to drive her through the creek to get over on the other side than to go up to the house. So there's such a different time. Most of us today can't imagine those times of of everywhere being like that. It's strange. Like, I'm thankful for pavement and good roads and all that, but like in my lifetime, the road that I do live on, it was gravel for most of that life, and Corey and Katie was probably about 5 or 6 years old when the state paved it. And there's part of me that wishes it wasn't paved. I wish it was still like that. Now, when it was dirt in those days, there was places in it that got really bad, just like Jesse talking about those rains. There was 2 particular places. There's a hill in one place that kind of a curve, and then a hill up, and then kind of back down, not a steep hill, but just an incline, and then you come on around, a little bit more, and there's a little bit more of the road, but it flattens back out kind of before it ever gets to Wilson Holler. But that little place right there would get bad in the winter, and you just have to fight your way through it in your car, and sometimes you get stuck. I got stuck one time and had to walk home with take off my high heels and walk home, and Granny thought that was so funny, but to get somebody to come pull my car out, So, but there is just part of me that wishes kind of it was still like that. Can't stop change, though, and can't stop progress, and there is lots of good, and it's good not to have to just totally be isolated like this because of the weather, because of the roads getting bad. Of course, that's a good thing. Now, that trip, though, from him describing them driving through the creek, and then just even before they got to that road, and then especially when they got out of the car and had to walk the rest of the way, my goodness, it sounded like such a beautiful, beautiful area. I wish I could have seen it. The first stopping there at the lady's house, and her telling them, her husband says it's 2 pipes worth or 2 miles. I love that part. But then for her, she said, no, you don't bear to the left, you don't bear to the right, you follow your nose because you're going straight ahead. I just love that. And then that she laughed, straight ahead. She sounds like somebody I would have liked to have got to know a lot better. I love that. And just the nature of the way Jesse's describing it and making the point of, he did say this is the furthest away from where his office is there in Lansboro, that he's going to go there first kind of and work his way back. But it's so remote, and then you get there, and then you still got to walk all that way. Once they left the woman, they still had a really far piece to walk before they got to the school. It's just so remote. And that's where the road ended, there in the creek. There was no driving past that. Now, of course, people would have had mules and horses and oxen and probably wagon. There might have been, I doubt there was much of a wagon road, though, or they'd probably tried to drive that car on it. Anyway, just such a rural, remote area. And in the same way that it makes me kind of wish my gravel road was not paved. It has been paved many, many years now, though, so there's no reason for me to even wish that. But I love that ruralness. I love that being back there and kind of tucked away and by yourself. That just really appeals to me. I don't know why. I would miss stuff. I'm not someone that says, even though I talk about the old days all the time, like I don't want to go back to the outhouses, and I'm glad for my modern conveniences as far as thinking about washing machines and lights and hot water and all that. I'm very thankful for all of it. But there is something appealing about living way back away from everything, where you're kind of secluded and just get to focus on day-to-day life. That's just really appealing to me. I love how he described the gentleman from town would come to that end of the road there in the creek. He would announce his day, and then everybody in that area would bring their kids, and they'd buy their shoes right there. Saved them a trip from going, and then also, I'm sure, for the man bringing the shoes, that was a good payday because he sold them all at one time, so it probably helped to work out for both of them. But I really love that, and I certainly, lived in a time when I was growing up. I had church shoes, I had everyday shoes, and I had, every year I got a new pair of shoes for school. So it wasn't like I was like these kids having to go barefoot all the time. But I remember the excitement of getting those school shoes, and I really loved it. And I bet they did too. I bet that was really, like they said, it kind of took on Jesse says it took on a joyous time. I bet it was like a really happy day for all of them. And those brogans, if you've ever heard of those shoes before, think of kind of a leather shoe, but really some people say, and I've heard various things, but they didn't even really matter which foot you put it on. But then they molded to your foot as you wore them. You had to wear them in, and they molded to your foot. And really kind of just a plain shoe. Now, over the years, like Pap had shoes like that when he was little, but over the years, like in my lifetime, that term brogans, which would have just been talking about that specific style of shoe in those days, is kind of morphed into, like Pap, would say, talking about boots, brogans, he'd call that, and that's very common in my area. You might hear somebody even say they got a new pair of brogans, and they're talking about boots. They're not talking about those shoes, but I really loved that picture. And then Mrs. Henthorn, oh my goodness, didn't you just love her? The determination. I mean, there she is. She says almost 70 before she got it, so I figure she's up in her 60s. And what determination. But then she's got that little school, and it's just, even though the building needs work, it's spick and span, and she's got it decorated, and those children all are, obviously respect her and admire her, and they're learning. They've recited all those poems. I mean, it's just amazing when you think about it. Of course, at the very beginning, the amazing part is that she recognizes immediately they're probably hungry and they don't have nothing to eat, and there's nowhere, like Jesse said, nowhere to get crackers and sardines. So she immediately rectifies that and gets everybody to donate a little bit of their dinner, and so that Jesse and the other gentleman there can have something to eat, because she knows they're hungry. Now, that dinner that she used, that's something I get asked about a lot. So my whole growing up life, this is how it's very common in my area. Breakfast is breakfast. If it was at home, we'd say dinner. What are you going to have for dinner? That was the noonday meal. Now, certainly at school, we ate in the lunchroom. I packed my lunch. It's like we used both kind of those. And then the evening meal, I only ever heard supper. I never heard it called dinner in my life until I was grown and thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Why does people call that dinner? That's supper. So it just, of course, is one of those things. It depends on where you grew up at and what you were used to saying. But so I love that. She says dinner, which is what I would say, which when I was at school, I probably said lunch. But today I say, Matt, what are you going to have for dinner? Actually, we just had dinner. I think Matt had crackers and cheese. I had watermelon. Oh, no, I know what we both had. I just forgot. I did have watermelon, but before that, and before Matt's crackers and cheese, talking about cornbread, this just goes perfectly. I can't believe I almost forgot that. We had cornbread, of course, for supper last night. So Matt come out on the porch with a big thing of cornbread and milk, and got me to taste it, and it was really good. And so then I thought, hey, that sounds pretty good. So I made me a little glass, crumbled up some cornbread, put some salt and pepper. I chopped up an onion and put onion, and then layered that, and then put milk on top of it. So I had that, and then I had my watermelon for dinner. Can't believe that's funny though that now it goes right along with this Jesse's dinner. Anyway, it was really good, but I love that, and mostly I loved the kids sharing it. And I've heard over the years of writing about Appalachia so many stories of where children did just they had to take their dinner to school with them to eat, and if they just had cornbread, a lot of times they were embarrassed, or maybe they just had biscuits. They didn't have nothing as nice as the other kids, in other words. But here it sounds like they were all on the level playing field there, so nobody even thought about it. And then, of course, they were really glad to get the cornbread. And Jesse says he don't think it's ever tasted so good. He'd had cornbread lots of times in his life. But thinking about that big long walk in there and just being out in the fresh air, I'm sure their hunger really was sharpened by all of that. But the determination that she showed, when you think about them pulling her up that hill, up that mountain every day, and then if they have to help her back down, and not just the determination of her, but the determination of those kids, because, I mean, and even the trustee and everybody, they're all like, we really love this lady and we want to support her, so we're going to do this. Every day, you boys, you're going to help her up there. And the girl's going to carry her books, and if it snows, we're just going to be a team effort, and we're all going to help her get safely down by using ropes. So what determination for all of them. Another thing that showed determination and wanting to learn was, she said, she apologized to Jesse that they were still barefooted, but the man hadn't come yet with the new shoes. But she said she had already noticed in some of the frost, she'd seen little blood spots. So those kids was wanting to go to school so bad. I'm sure their foot had just broke open somehow. The kids in those days, their feet got tough as leather. But of course, sometimes you stepped on something and they broke open. You got a little splinter or something in there caused a sore, you know, lots of different things. It's hard on your feet to go barefooted all the time, but that really showed, both of those showed such desire to learn, and then just such pure determination. Really admirable, I think. And even that it took her 50 years to get her degree, again, determination, and really something to admire. She'd realized by then, like she makes that statement to Jesse, the older you get, the less they want you. You know, all through this book, we've heard about the pretty young teachers, so that's what they were looking for, and probably thinking too that they were just, if you're younger and straight out of school, you know more than maybe some older person, and maybe in Jesse's situation, he was a man, he was younger, but he could handle, and he proved he could handle the ruffians, you know, in all the schools. Anyway, real determination by her. After the really dry summer that we've had and how it's affected some of our stuff, like our beans, I really feel for them with their failure there. The drought had caused in their tobacco and their cane. Totally not affected us like that at all because we're not as dependent. So they were dependent on the tobacco and the cane, which was probably sorghum cane, to sell so that they had income. That was that. And then also it says even their food crops didn't do good. Well, that definitely they were dependent on that so that they could make it through the winter. You know, that was what they, again, so isolated there, they had to be self-sufficient, so they had to put all that food up so that they could make it. So that part really makes me feel for them, and that it was a failure to the point that the tobacco was just left in the fields. You know, it was just left there. It wasn't even worth harvesting, wasn't even worth, so that had to be a sad, sad time for that community. And then it's sad, but I really liked when Jesse's walking around the outside of the school building and he realized it's ramshackle, he says. You know, some of the boards are gone. You can see inside the studs, and he's just worried. And then he realizes, you know, oh my goodness, the wind probably, these windstorms come through here. What if it blows it all up and just blows it away and kills the people inside it? And do these children worry about that? And here they are having to come to school here. And then I think Jesse quickly realizes, well, he don't say this part, but I'm just inferring it. He probably realizes the two things. One is he notices how happy they are. So no, they're not sitting there worried that their building may blow down in a windstorm. They're not worried about that at all. They're just enjoying learning, and they're thriving, and they're doing good. But I would say the other thing is people that live like that and that live that close to the land, if they recognized that it was going to be a windstorm like that or the weather was turning, I'm sure they would immediately all go home. You know, they just knew, they understood that. So probably those two things. But I think that was too, if you think about it, those people, the kids, and her too. Now she'd been teaching there 4 years, she said. That was life. So it's like that's just part of their daily life. Even if there is a chance of that, well, that's like the obstacle or the fear that they face each day, so it's not as fearful to them as it would be to us or even to Jesse, thinking, oh my goodness, this place could blow down. This is very trivial but sort of similar. In a lot of mine and Matt's videos, people will say, you know, because of being outside in the woods or in the garden or whatever, don't you worry about snakes and bears and ticks. Those are the things, like the ticks. And I think, well, yeah, I mean, we do keep an eye out. I don't want to step on a copperhead and get bit. But there's snakes everywhere, and I've never let a snake make me stay inside. I mean, it's just part of my daily life. I just know to keep my eye out for a snake. Same thing with ticks. There is ticks here, and sometimes we have ticks on us, and you know there is a danger of Lyme disease and all that. You have to be real serious and take it serious if you get bit, and especially, you know, Rocky Mountain spotted fever and all those things. But again, I can't imagine letting ticks make me not go about my daily life, because my whole life I've had, you know, had ticks get attached to me and had to get them off, and it doesn't happen often. It's not every time you go outside. It would kind of be like the windstorm. There wasn't a windstorm every day of the week they had to worry about. It would just be ever so often, maybe once every 3 or 4 years a big windstorm would come or something like that. It'd be the same thing for a tick. Maybe just every 2 or 3 years I might get one, you know, find one behind my ear or something that's attached, or you might see a copperhead and maybe you don't see one for 2 years or something. So it's that same thing. If that's your daily life, it doesn't seem as fearful. Those things don't to you. And I guess the end of it, the last thing I have to say is Jesse saying that he wished the students in Lansboro could come to that school and see it. And of course, I was immediately reminded of Pap. He'd always tell me, Tipper, you ought to always look around you and you'll find somebody worse off than you are. And kind of practicing, Pap would have never said practicing gratefulness, but that's something you hear today. But he did teach me and Steve and Paul to be grateful for what we had, because there was always somebody that had less, whether it's material or like thinking family, love and family and food to eat and, all those kind of things. Of course, there's people that had more than us too, but he just teaching that to be really grateful for what you have really enriches your whole life. It really, really does, if you can look on things being positive like that. But I can see that in Jesse. He knows if all those students could come and experience that for one day, the walk up the mountain even, the sparseness of the school, the kind of the dilapidated, the ramshackledness of it, like he said, they would be like, oh my goodness, we have so much to be thankful for in Lansboro, where we've got nice straight streets and sidewalks, or whatever they had. They may not have had sidewalks to walk on, and it's so easy, and everything's big and nice, and we have these extra things, and they would have definitely felt like that. So I really love that. Jesse could see that clearly, because he is. Now he's superintendent of all these schools, so you can't help but compare them in his mind. And he's thinking of the land of plenty there, and then this school that's kind of, the poor teachers got to be pulled up the mountain every morning and let down with ropes if it snows, but yet they're thriving too. I mean, they're doing really good, but he knows it would make those others be really doubly thankful for what they have. So I really love this part of the book. I hope you did. It makes me wish I could get in the car myself and drive to this place and then hike up the mountain, see that lady on the way and ask her where to go and let her tell me, follow your nose, straight ahead. And then visiting that wonderful school, I would have just loved it all. And especially the mountain views that Jesse talked about in autumn with he called them leaf clouds, the colorful leaf clouds. That would have been a really beautiful trip. I wish I could have made it with him. I hope you'll leave a comment and let me know what you liked about this part of the book. And I hope you drop back by next Friday so we can see what happens to Jesse next.